Hello guys, welcome to another video of our React tutorial. In this video we're going to talk about another React hook which is called the useReducer hook. So while we're talking about the useReducer hook, we all know that state management is crucial in React, but sometimes useState isn't enough. So we'll explore how useReducer is so powerful in handling complex state logic. And by the end of this video, you understand how to manage state updates in a very well structured way. We know that useState is great for simple state management, but it can become very messy when handling complex logic. For example, if you want to manage a state for a counter with multiple actions, increment action, decrement action, you want to reset, you want to do multiple things, it becomes very messy to use the useState hook. That is where useReducer provides the structured way of managing complex states. In useReducer, we're going to use actions, we're going to use reducer functions in handling all of this. Now let's look at when to use the useReducer hook instead of the useState hook. One, I said when state management update depends on the previous state. So when your state management, when you want to track the previous state of your application, and the next state depends on it, you're going to use useReducer because useState will not be efficient. And I also said when managing multiple states value in one place, you have a state of an input, you have input for registration, input for name, email, password, phone number, and you want to manage all of these input in one particular place. You use useReducer hook because it helps in complex state management. I also said when the state modifications require complex logic, you want to update a state, it's not just for you to use the setter, the state setter to update the state. You want to write a very complex logic to update your state. You do that using the useReducer hooks. So now let's look at how the useReducer works. Here I said it uses three approaches, right? Let's break this down. We say the state, it has a state, which is the current state of the component, right? And it also has an action. An action is an object describing what changes to make. You want to make a change to your state. Your action will describe what changes you want to make to the state, right? And I have the reducer function. The reducer function is a pure function that updates the state based on the action. Let's say I want to change the user full name input, right? That could be my action. The state could be the initial state of the user full name input, and I'm going to have a function which is called the reducer function that will update that particular state based on the action I provide for it. So here we're going to look at the basic syntax for the useReducer hook. From what you can see, I'll have a constant keyword. Of course, we have the two values, the state and the dispatch, which is equal to the useReducer hook. The useReducer hook is taking two parameters. The first parameter is the reducer function, and the second parameter is the initial state. Remember, we said the useReducer helps us we use the useReducer hook when the previous state of our component is important or the next state depends on the previous state. So we're looking at the initial state and we're having the reducer function. Of course, here, say the state is the current state, right? And the dispatch, which of course is the action, is the function to trigger the state update. Just take back your mind to useState hook, where you have the state and the setter, where we usually use the set state so in this case, the dispatch, which is the second parameter here, is the action that triggers the update. And here we have the reducer function, which is the first parameter of the useReducer hook. Reducer function handles the state change based on the action type. So you're going to dispatch your state, which is you're going to trigger your state update passing your type of action, and the reducer function updates that based on the action type, right? And of course, here is the initial state of your component. So we're going to head over to our code editor, and we're going to see how to implement the useReducer hook in our application. We're going to create a counter application that we're going to use the reducer hook instead of the useState hook, and we're going to see how all of these are done. So here in our code editor and in our first React application we've been using throughout this series, we're going to see how to create a counter with the useReducer hook. So the first thing we're going to do here is to create the reducer function. Remember, we said the useReducer accepts the reducer function and the initial state. Right, so we're going to create the reducer function. We're going to do that by saying create the reducer function. So I'm going to create a function. I'm going to say function, and use the function keyword. Counter reducer. Right. So this counter reducer, what it's going to do for us is it's going to accept two parameters. It's going to accept the state and it's going to accept the action, right? It's going to accept state and it's going to accept action. Right, when we do that, we're going to use the switch statement. We're going to use the switch statement to know the type of action that is being triggered, and we're going to write the logic for that particular action. Remember, we said the reducer function is being triggered based on the action provided. So we're going to use the switch statement. We're going to say switch. Of course, the switch is going to take the action type, action.type. And if we do this, we're going to say, let me format this, right? So we already have suggestions. So we're going to have three different cases. We're going to have action for increment, we're going to have action for decrement, and we're going to have action to reset our state, excuse me. So I'm going to say if the case is increment, right? If the case is increment, what happens? I want us to return our counter to be state dot counter plus 1. So remember we said if we went, or let me do this very well. Remember we said if your state update depends on previous state, you use the useReducer. That is why we're having this state.counter. This is the previous state of our application of this our counter, and we're just adding one to the previous state, right? So we're going to create another action. So if we say case, if case is equals to decrement, right? What happens? We're going to return counter should be equal to state.counter minus 1, right? Let me correct this. Right. So if you want to trigger a decrement action, we return this, which means we're subtracting 1 from the previous state, right? And the last action is going to be a reset action. We want to reset our state to default. We're going to say if case is equal to reset, right? If case is equal to reset, I'm going to return the counter to be 0, right? And of course, we're going to have the default. We're going to return the state, right? So 3 actions: increment, decrement, and reset, right? So what's the next thing we're going to do? The next step we're going to take is to use the reducer in our component, right? To use the reducer in our component. And how do we do that? We're going to have our initial state. Remember, reducer function depends on initial state. So here we're going to create our initial state, and I'm going to say const initial state, and counter is equal to 0, right? This is our initial state. So what then do we do? We're going to create the useReducer function. We're going to initialize the useReducer function where we can pass in the counter reducer, and we're also going to pass in the initial state, just like I demonstrated before in a slide when I gave us the syntax for the useReducer hook, right? So I'm going to do that by creating a state. I'm going to say const state, and I'm going to have dispatch which is equal to useReducer hook. Remember to import your useReducer from React, very important, so you don't have issues. This is going to have our counter reducer, which is the function we've already declared, right? And it's going to have our initial state, which is the initial state variable we already declared, right? So what's the next thing to do in this case? The next thing to do is to create our user interface, which is, of course, we call components, that will help us to trigger these changes, right? So here we're just going to create simple stuff. We're going to create a single parent component, a div, yeah, and I'm going to have just a text h1, okay, let's say h3, a h3 text that is going to be our counter. It's going to hold our counter. I'm going to use a ternary operator, not really ternary operator. I'm just going to use write my variable in my JSX, right? So this is going to hold our counter. So I'm going to create three buttons. One button is going to dispatch the increment action. The second button is going to dispatch the decrement action, and the third button is going to dispatch the reset action. So how do I do that? I'm going to create a button. I'm going to call this button increment action, right? I'm going to duplicate this button. Yeah, so I'm going to call this decrement action, and I'm going to call this reset action. Right, I have three of these. So what's the next thing to do? I'm going to add event listeners to this. I'm going to use the onClick event. Let me correct this, please. I'm going to use the onClick event. And here I'm saying I'm going to dispatch an action. Remember, we have the dispatch here as the second parameter for our useReducer hook, right? And I'm going to dispatch this action, and I'm going to specify the type of action I want to dispatch. Here I'm saying the increment action. Yeah, this is just a styling, right? So I'm saying when I click on this button, dispatch this action. What type of action do you want to dispatch? I want to dispatch an increment action. So if I copy this and I also paste in the decrement, and I also paste in the reset. So I'm going to say this is going to be decrement and this is going to be reset. Remember, this type of actions, these action types must correspond with your switch cases, right? If your switch case is in camel case or is in uppercase, it must correspond with the type of action you're dispatching, so you don't have issues. So if I save this, I'm going to, of course, this is already exported. Let's just make sure everything is okay. All right, so let me walk you through this again. I first of all created a reducer function with my case statement, right? Switch statement rather, and I'm having three cases. The increment case, if the action is increment, I want you to, oh sorry, this is supposed to be action.type, right? So if the type of action is increment, I want you to return this. If it's decrement, I want you to return this. So what are we returning? We are returning the initial state -1 because I want to reduce. Here I'm returning the initial state +1 because I want to increase, right? And yeah, here I'm returning initial state to be 0 because I want to reset the 0 to. But remember, then I created an initial state variable, which of course is holding our counter property, and our counter property is 0 initially. So I initialize the useReducer hook with the first variable, which is the state, and second variable, which is the dispatch, which dispatches the action to the state. The useReducer hook accepts first parameter, which is the counter reducer, which is the reducer function we already created, and the second parameter is the initial state of that. So after that, we created just a simple UI with a single parent component, which holds the counter, holds the button. So this is where the button, the action is being triggered. We trigger the action using the dispatch, and we specified the type of dispatches, the type of actions we want to dispatch. The first button is dispatching the increment action, the second button is dispatching the decrement action, and the third button is dispatching the reset action, right? So let's save this and try to run an application. I'm opening my terminal, and I'm going to say npm run dev. This is going to open up our application in port 5173. Opening this in my browser, we have these three buttons, even though they are looking so ugly, so ugly, right? As we proceed, we're going to see how we can style with CSS. So if you see, this is my counter. I'm going to change the color of my counter so it doesn't look so bad. I'm going to add color to my counter, or let's have a parent color. So I'm going to give this a color of black. If I save this is supposed to be black. Yes, I have this. So I'm going to style my buttons so it will look a little bit beautiful. I'm going to give it a background color of green and a color of white, padding and a border of none, and I'm going to give it a border radius of 5 pixels. Right, okay, I already have style here, so if I do this, this is what we have, right? So it's basically the same thing, and I'm just going to give it a margin of 10 pixels. I'm going to give it a font size of, let's say, 20, font size of 10. So I'm just going to copy this style and paste in all of my buttons. And I'm going to give this man here a height of 100 VH. So yeah, so this looks a little bit okay. So this is what we have. We have our initial state to be 0. If you go back here, you have your initial state, which is in our h3 tag as the state.counter, right? And we have a button to increase, to decrease, and to reset. So if you click on this button, we are adding 1 to our initial state. Whenever I click on the button, we are increasing the state. This is 10, right? So if I click on the decrement action, I'm dispatching the decrement action, which is actually reducing the state to 0. All right. So if I increase this, if this is, let's say, 20, and I click on the reset action, this takes it back to 0. So this is how to create a simple counter application using the useReducer hook instead of using the useState. This is simpler, this is easier, and it's more efficient for this kind of action. So our next example, we're going to look at how to handle complex stakes for form inputs, and of course, let's see how if you can build a to-do list using the useReducer hook. So first, we're going to create a form reducer, which is going to replace our counter reducer, right? We're going to create a form reducer. So first, let's make this cleaner. So I don't want to delete the code we have here. I'm going to go over to our components. Let's go over to our state. I'm going to create a page where I can put all of this. I'm going to name this useReducer1, useReducer1.jsx. So I'm going to have all of this inside of there. So I'm going to say function useReducer1 I'm going to name this useReducer1. Right, and I'm going to export it as default useReducer1. So I'm just going to copy all of this we have here, probably cut all of it out, and I'm going to use them here. If you're doing this, don't forget to import your useReducer, and always import your React. Very important. Yeah, if you do that, I think we're good. Yes. So if I save this and go back to my app.jsx, and I have the useReducer is no longer used here, and I'm just going to return this. Let's correct this. Yeah, so if I go back here to try to return the useReducer1, I've imported it. You see, I imported it from the state, right? This is not supposed to be in the state. This is supposed to be in a page. So let's create a page folder. Let's create a page folder, and let's move our useReducer1 to our page. So we'll have useReducer1 in our page. Of course, automatically it's updated in my code, and I'm just going to save. If I do this and we go back to application, we still have what we have here, right? So the essence of this is to help us create our next application, which of course is going to be a to-do list where we can apply useReducer to multiple functions, or multiple inputs rather. So in our page, I'm going to create another file called to-do.jsx. So in our to-do page, we're going to of course follow the same thing we did in our reducer. We're going to create a reducer function, we're going to create initial state, we're going to create the useReducer hook, and we're going to create our user interface, which is our component. So here, the first thing we're going to do, of course, always remember to import React from React. So if we do that, we're going to create our main function, which is, of course, we're going to name it to do app to do, right? Let's just do to do, so it doesn't look like it's a different app. To do is just still part of our main app. So if we do this, we're going to export as default. Very important. If we export as default, right? So the first thing we're going to do in this case, we're first of all going to create our initial state. To do, let me explain before we continue coding. If you want to create a to-do app, it means you're going to have array of items, array of things to do, right? I want to play football today, but for 2 hours. After 2 hours, I want to take my bath, I want to take a nap, I want to have my breakfast, dinner, or lunch, I want to visit a friend, I want to play a computer game, I want to hang out, I want to go for shopping, I want to go for movies, see movies, and I want to come back to write my code. These are 10 different items to do today, 10 different things to do today, and I'm just going to add them. I'm just writing them in a book that will remind me, okay, you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to do that. This is just exactly what we're building. We're having these items in an array, and this array is going to hold our to-do list. So by default, our book is empty. So we're saying our array is empty by default. So we're going to create a default state for our array. So I'm going to create a const just like we did before. Const initial state should be equal to an empty array, right? Our initial state should be equal to an empty array. So after that, what is the next thing to do? We're going to create our reducer function. We're going to say function. We're going to create function to do reducer. Of course, we already have an idea what it's supposed to look like. We're going to use our switch statement. We're going to say switch, which is of course going to take action, the type. So we're going to take the type of action we want to trigger, right? After that, the next thing we're going to specify is to specify the cases, right? First case is to add to do, right? First case is to add my to do, and what is that going to do for us? It's just going to return. It's going to return the initial state, and it's going to add the new state to it, right, based on the timestamp. I'm going to do that. I'm going to see what we're going to do. So I'm going to say return the initial state, so in my add case, I'm just going to return the initial state, right? So I'm going to return the initial state, but mind you, in our reducer, to do reducer, we're expecting the initial state and we're expecting the action. Don't forget to do this. So here I'm returning just the initial state, and after that I'm going to add a new item to the to-do list, which of course is going to be an object with ID property. The ID, I'm just going to, let's just use our current date. I'm using the date.now property, date.now. Yeah, this is going to give us the current date as the ID. So each time we create a new So for the add case, I'm just going to return the initial state, and of course I'm going to add a new item to the state, which is going to have the ID property. For the ID, we're going to have just the date.now. .now, right, a new date.now. That will do for the ID. And after the ID, what else can we add to our to-do list? Of course, the text or the to-do. Let's just call it to-do. What do we actually need to do? The to-do is going to be the action dot payload. So the action is going to come with payload. The payload is going to be the text we're getting from the input we want to type, right? And we're going to have another property called completed. So this to know if we've completed the action, and completed by default is going to be false. So this is what we, each time we add a to-do list, we're going to want to copy the initial state, sorry about that, initial state, and create a new object in our state. So don't forget to always have your state and your action, right, as your properties. So if we do this, let's create another case just in case. Let's create another case which we're going to name toggle. So this is going to tell us if we've completed a task or we've not completed a task, right? Because we have a completed property here, so we should be able to toggle completed to be true or completed to be false, right? Here in this case, we're just going to return the state, right? State.map. We're going to map throughout the state, and we're going to return the to do, right? If you followed us when we talked about list rendering, you should be used to the map method, right? So what is this trying to do? It's trying to get the ID of the to do you want to change, right? So for example, I have 5 items to complete today. I've completed one. I need to get that particular one I've completed and change its completed property to true. So I need to get the ID of that particular one to doing. I want to change either the ID or the name, right? So I'm just mapping through them, and I'm saying where to do dot ID is equal to let's use it triple equal to is equal to action dot payload. So we're going to pass a payload that will be compared to what we're doing, and I'm saying if that is true, if I have anything like that, right, I'm going to just change the property, everything in the to do, and I'm just going to change the completed property to true, completed property to what is not in the to do dot completed. So I'm going to explain this, and if there is nothing like that, I'm just going to return everything in to do. Right, so let me explain this. If I map through my to do, which is my state, and I'm looking for where to do is equal to the payload I'm passing. If there's anything like that, I want to return everything in that to do and change the completed property to what is not the completed property. This is not keyword, not completed property. So if the completed property in my state is true, I want to change it to what is not true. So if what is not true is false. If it is false, I want to change it to what is not false. So I'm always going to change it to opposite of its initial state. And if I don't find anything there, I want to just return everything I have in my to do. Right, and that we're going to have a default as well. And if my default, I just want to return my state. So this is it for our to-do reducer. After that, the next thing we're going to do in this application is to create a useReducer hooks, and of course create a user interface. So how do we do that? Yeah, here we're going to create our useReducer hook. We're going to say const to-dos, which is going to be dispatch, right, should be equal to excuse me, useReducer. Please remember to import your useReducer from React. Right, useReducer, here we're going to have our reducer function, and we're going to have our initial state. Here we created our reducer function, which is already the to-do reducer, and here we have our initial state, which is our initial state, right? This is our, yeah, let's just make sure everything is correct. Here, oh, they're not correct. So this is supposed to be out of this function block. Yeah, so we're correct here. Let me close this so it doesn't confuse us. So I have the initial state, I have the to-do reducer, which is the reducer function, which we've passed to our useReducer, right? So the next thing to do, of course, we need to create a state that will hold the change of input values. So I'm going to create a state using the useState hook. I'm going to say text should be set text. If you don't know what we're doing here, we're using the useState hook, and you can go back to watch our useState video to understand what we're doing. And by default, the value is empty, right? So after that, what is the next thing we're going to do? We're going to create a function that will help us to add to do to our list, right? We're going to create a function that will add to do to our list. And how do we do that? We're just going to create a function. I'm going to add a text, say create function, create to trigger the to do add, right? And I'm going to call this if I'm going to use an arrow function. I'm going to say const add to do should be equal to, right? If I do this, add to be should be equal to. So what are we doing? What are we doing? Remember, if you want to do that, you always use the dispatch keyword from your useReducer hook, right? So I'm going to say I'm going to dispatch. So what are we dispatching? I'm going to dispatch a type, an object with a type of course, here we have the type to be, if we go back to this function, we have this type to be add. So we're going to have this type as add. That is the type we want to dispatch. And we're going to have a payload. Remember, our reducer function is expecting a payload here. So we're saying this is going to be supposed to be, please correct this. This is supposed to be state, right? Not use action states. That's autocomplete. This is supposed to be state, and we have state is supposed to have payload. If the state.type is this, and or if the state.payload is this, so that's why we have the state.type and the state.payload. So if we do that, we're just going, this is just going to be the text, of course, which is this text. So whatever thing the user imputed, we're going to add it to the state. And after dispatch, we just want to clear this input by setting this back to default, right? So this is our to-do function that will enable us add to do. So the next thing we're going to do is to build our user interface. Next thing to do is to build our user interface. And how do we do that? I'm just going to return a single parent div, a single parent component. Inside the div, I'm going to have an input with the value. Of course, we know about this. I'm going to have a div with the input value. All right, the value, of course, is going to be the text, which is the state we've already created. All right, let me just close this so we make it better. After the value, we're going to have the onChange action, which is going to be what will happen when we start typing. Please refer back to our input and event handling video if you are confused here. I'm just going to go straight to integrate this. So after that is it for our input. Oops. Thank God for Ctrl Z. That is it for our input, and I'm going to create a button. This button is just going to have a text called add to do. So if we do this, this button, of course, is going to have an event, right? It's going to have an on-click event, and we already created our event handler. Our event handler is the add to do. So I'm just going to call the add to do event handler. So now we've created this. The next thing we're going to do is to see how we can list all our to do, right? If I save this and we'll go back to our application, this is what we're seeing, because this is exactly what we're rendering in our app.js. But if we comment this out and try to import our to do, right, and render our to do, please remember to import your to do from here, right, from page to do. If I save this, we'll go back. This is what we have. We have an input and we have a button looking very, very ugly, but our concern is not in the styling. Our concern is in the application. But before that, let's just add a simple style to the parent. I'm going to give this a height of 100 view height. I'm going to give it a background color of white. And let's save this looking okay. So I'm just going to break the line between this. So this is what we have. So let's just see. Let me make this to display flex. Let me just add few styling, please. All right, so this is okay. So this is okay. So this is what we have. All right, so sorry about that. I was just trying to make it look at least better, right? So we have this, and let's just go and copy our style property for a button, please, from what we did in our first example, and I'm going to just paste it in this button, so at least our button will look beautiful. It's looking fine. And so the next thing we're going to do is to see how we can display our to-do items, right? We're going to use the unordered list. We're going to use the unordered list, right? I'm just going to break this, and I'm going to use the unordered list. Inside my unordered list, remember my to-do is now an array, my to-do is an array. My to-dos is an array, so I can map through them and list all the to-dos. That is what we're going to do now. I'm going to say to-dos.map, to-dos.map. Of course, I'm going to have the to-do, and I'm going to have my index, right? Very important. And this is just going to return, my list. Of course, I'm going to have, in my list, I'm going to have the key, which is going to be the index, right? Very important. And I'm going to have, let's just display what we have there. We're going to have the to-do, which of course is this, to-do.text. That's because when we're creating this object from here, when we're creating this object in a reducer function, we had, when we're dispatching, not actually here, when we're dispatching, where is that? Yes, here. When we're dispatching the action, we have the text, which is our payload, which is this text. So let's just confirm if we have this property in our to-do. Go back here. So here we don't have text, we have it as to-do. So we're going to have to-do.to-do. That's funny. So this is going to be, so let's change this to items so it doesn't confuse us. This is going to be items.to-do. So we're going to have here as items.to-do. So this is what we have, right? Let's go back to see if everything is working. Our reducer function is here. Our initial state is up here. Our useReducer hook, our useState hook, our function to trigger our add, and one more thing remaining, we've not added the event handler that will help us to toggle between completed and not completed. So we're going to do that, but before we do that, make sure everything is ordered. So we have the to-do reducer, right, which is a reducer function. We have the initial state. We have our to-dos, which is of course our useReducer hook. We have the useState hook. We have this, which is going to, this is add to do, right? Please take note of this. And this and toggle to do. So what this does is to This is supposed to toggle the to do, right? And this is supposed to add the to do. So let's go down to see what happens here. If we save this, let's see what happens in our application. If we reload, if I type in sleep and eat, that's what in my to do. See, it appears here as sleep and eat, right? If I type something else, say play soccer, play football, if I add this, it adds play football, right? Right. So the next thing we're going to do is to add an event listener to this list. So if I click on it, I should toggle between completed or not, because from here you see I have a text decoration, which of course is showing me if the text or if the to-do does completed, which is of course here stated here. If it is completed, I want the line to go through, so I want to draw line through it. If it's not completed, I don't want to draw line through it, right? So how do we do that? Remember we said if we toggle on, if we click on this, you should be able to toggle. All right, so let's add a cursor. Let's add a cursor of pointer to this. So this is going to have a pointer effect. So the next thing we're going to do is to add on-click event to this list. Go back to our event handling video and get what we're doing here. So what I'm going to do is to dispatch. Remember I said there is an action we are expecting, which is the toggle action. So I'm dispatching a type, I'm dispatching an action with the type of toggle to do, right? And if I do that, I'm also going to provide the payload, because remember in the toggle to do, we are expecting a payload here. So I'm also going to dispatch a payload, which is only going to be the todo.id, right? todo.id. So if I do this, I think that's all for that. And I'm going to save. I'm going to do Control S to save, and we'll go back to application to reload. So the first thing I'm going to do today is record a video, right? I say record a video, please forgive me. After that, I'm going to get ready for work. Get ready for work. After that, I'm going to have my lunch. I'm not going to skip my breakfast, of course. I'm going to have my breakfast, and if I click on this, it means I've completed this video. You can see a line striking through it. If I get ready for work, I'm done with work, and if I click on have breakfast, I've had my breakfast. So now let me refresh our mind to why useReducer is better. If you look at what we did from our first example to our second example, you see that state management is being centralized. It's centralized in our reducer function. It is easier to scale when adding more actions. So if I want to add more actions to this, I don't just want to add and complete. I want to do actions like pending, completion, in progress, have completed, and completed. All I'm going to do is to add more actions. Easier to scale and easier to manage. And of course, it's more readable than handling multiple states using useState. So here is my final thought. The useReducer hook makes managing complex states very, very easy and scalable, unlike using the useState hook. So subsequently, if you want to manage any complex states, please head over to the useReducer. And that is it for this video, guys. I'm going to make the link to this code available in this video. I'm going to push it to GitHub, and I'm going to make the link available to this video. You can clone it and go through it and make your manipulations. See you guys in the next video. Please don't forget to like, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to share, drop your comments, and I'm going to respond to your comment, right? So see you guys in the next video. Bye for now.